Jiro here from Umbra Games with a review of Aeternoblade II, played on a physical PlayStation 4 copy for the review, released on October 10th, 2019, and the ESRB-rated North American copies are available exclusively at Amazon.com directly from the developer. It's also available digitally on Xbox One and soon to be available physically on Switch via Amazon later in 2019. I personally wasn't familiar with the Aeternoblade series until I happened to catch wind of this second installment on Twitter. The first game is available digitally for PlayStation 4 and Vita on the PlayStation Store. I believe it was actually originally released on the 3DS eShop as well. Aeternoblade 2 is mostly side-scrolling 2.5D action role-playing game. I say mostly because when you look at the majority of screenshots or gameplay, you're going to see that familiar 2D look like a Castlevania game. And with the Metroidvania aspects of the game, you're not too far off. The game has several rooms though, and boss fights that actually open up to a full 3D, using the right stick to control the camera and the left stick to move. You otherwise fight as usual. You can lock onto enemies with the click of L3 in this mode, but there's no flicking between enemies, and it seems to usually lock onto the closest one to your character. The camera does get a little rough in these situations as well, as with a lot of old school 3D platformers, like where you'll get the wall in your way occasionally. But once you get used to that, that's a minor inconvenience. There's one boss though that relies on quick 3D platforming in this 3D space. You have no shadow to tell you where you're going to land, and every jump readjusts the camera to look straight ahead and up just a little bit. Yeah, that's not good. The game begins with a dark abyss opening in the world of Chronosia, and in the first couple of hours of the game you're switched between three characters: Freya from the first Aeternoblade wielding a sword, Bernard who wields a giant axe, and Felix that has one of those swords that turns into a whip dealy. Is there an official name for those? Anyway, the switching takes place by reaching quest markers and story points during the first few hours. Each character receives unique time magic that can be used to navigate the puzzles you encounter as well as for combat. Each character also has a list of 35 attacks and combos. Now, the square button is your normal attack, triangle is a crouched attack, and R2 does a launch. Pressing these attack buttons in various sequences will perform different moves and combos. It doesn't really seem to be a cancel though, although the dash button, R1, will sometimes seem to get you out of a commitment, but that doesn't really stop this game from just turning into a button masher when it comes to combat. Enemies will sometimes telegraph their attacks by a glowing streak near their eyes. If you attack right before they attack, you can perform a parry, but you can also use that R1 dash blink ability to dodge through the threat, if the developers decided that that was one of the enemies that could be passed through. This can also trigger counterattacks if pressed at the right moment. Enemies can drop red orbs to fill your health or blue orbs to fill your mana. You'll also see yellow orbs that are used as experience points and green to refill your ultimate ability meter. You'll encounter checkpoints as you venture through the world that have shrines, refilling both health and mana, and here you can also use your yellow orbs to purchase stat and skill upgrades. Relic setups are shared between characters. You can obtain relics and equip 2 sets of 3, only one set of which is active at a time. Relic bonuses include things like increased HP or attack power. Set 1 and Set 2 can be used by any of the 3 characters though, and flip through by hitting L1 at any time. The configuration of relics can also be changed at those checkpoints. You'll find relic upgrades through your travels, which can be added and subtracted from relics at any time once found, increasing the potency of the relic. One thing that really stands out with Aeternoblade is the different uses of magic each character gets. Freya's first ability, for example, is the ability to create warp points, and then pressing the button again to travel back to it. She also learns to rewind time, both including her, so if you take a major hit or die, you can travel back a little bit as long as you have mana, or you can just do the enemies and platforms. So if you had an enemy stunned and do a bunch of damage, you can rewind back to the beginning of the stun and keep piling that damage on. Bernard gets the ability to stop time, and Felix can record himself doing actions, and then when you stop recording, it will immediately play a double, which will be created to do what you just did, allowing you to avoid enemy attacks that you may have gotten hit with while recording, and also doubling up the damage on foes. Using time abilities on enemies will also put them in an immune state from your time magic for a while. All of these actions are also used in puzzles, both in general world navigation as well as the puzzle rooms. Now these rooms are found at all of the checkpoints you discover and require you to be on a specific character or have a specific magical ability, often used to solve the puzzle inside. And here, as with many of the rooms you enter, when you die or you want to restart, you can just restart from the checkpoint or at the beginning of the zone. So no discovering a checkpoint and then dying and then having to go back to the last time you saved. It does do this autosave for you. The game will always start you in the room that you just entered, at the status you were in. This does rob a little of the challenge that is present in this style of games. On the other hand, it removes some points of frustration, especially if you're trying to get through a puzzle that has some one-hit spikes on it. One other great concept Aeternoblade 2 uses is the presence of a 3D map. Even though so much of the game is done through 2D navigation, as you're walking along, the road will curve or the camera will shift up high, giving you some marvelous views of your surroundings. While this can make figuring out where you are, which direction you're facing, and how to get to the quest marker on your map slightly more difficult, the depth it adds to the world can totally be worth it. Additional walls, though, to help you tell where the map ends, so you're not wondering later while trying to figure out where to go if something is a dead end or not, would have been helpful. The screen transition points between screens can get you also if you're not careful. I think I'm usually used to walking through a doorway, where my character is practically off screen before I move on to the next area. But Aeternoblade II can have this happening several virtual feet away from the edge of the screen, both in its horizontal and vertical transitions. I've taken down a powerful enemy the majority of the way just to accidentally step one step too far, but still clearly in the room, and start the transition, losing all the damage I just did. A lot of encounters will lock you in, though, until you defeat the enemies for those progression battles, though. The game runs well on PlayStation 4. I didn't have any noticeable frame rate drops at any point. The action, no matter how many enemies were on screen or how giant the boss was, didn't seem to cause any issues. I did have about 5 blue screen crashes though, and coincidentally most of the time I was trying to use a healing item when I got a boss down to about 10% of their health. The game's autosave checkpoint, as I mentioned though, saved me in one of those battles from too much time loss. I noticed they count the number of saves on your save slot every time you do it, and I wasn't sure if there's a trophy or something maybe tied to that at first, so I was kind of sparing my saving, but after a couple of crashes I got a little too nervous and started saving at every shrine I passed. The bosses did begin as a highlight of this game, with a variety of attacks and patterns to learn. Then as you run into the bosses time and time again reused, that shininess wears off. There are also some quick time events on some of the boss fights that I really could have done without. They'll take place either before or after. Even if you fail after though, it just takes you back to the beginning of the cutscene where the input was required. Further illustrating the point, I'm not really sure why they're even in there. As far as world design goes, you do get to experience a couple different areas and dimensions, but one video game trope that I thought we'd all sort of left behind a decade ago was flipping a switch somewhere not even remotely close to a door that switch opens. In Aeternoblade II, if you pay extra special attention to all the places you've been where you can see a locked gate, you'll probably have some luck. But when you look at a map and see a quest marker close by that you can't get to, you'll find yourself having to take a deep dive into the dungeon, hoping to find a random switch somewhere that does the job, allowing you to proceed. The aforementioned shrines do act as fast travel points though, so you can get from place to place pretty quickly, but it still feels like a chore. There are a few side quests in the game in addition to the main quests, and it's difficult at times though to tell which one is main and what is side. The final thing I'll say in regards to game design is the point of a Metroidvania style game, to me, is to get new abilities that help you reach and open places you've been before. The narrative of the game, without giving any spoilers here, often gives you abilities and takes them away. So you'll reach a place you could get to before, but now you can't. The back and forth ended up being a little bit frustrating. Overall, I think there may be 6 things you get off and on for the first 8 hours before they finally turn over the full set to you pretty permanently, but then nothing new is introduced for the rest of the game. When presented with room navigation requiring the 4 navigation abilities that consume mana, if you make a mistake and are finding yourself low on mana, you either have to use a potion in one of the 3 equipment slots you can fill up at a shrine, run to a shrine and restore your mana, or wait for the 1 MP a second build up and go get something to drink or go to the restroom, waiting so that you can continue. Now if you enter a room with full mana and you make a mistake, you can restart the room with the status you arrived in by selecting it from the in-game menu. That is, if you didn't accidentally step that step too far and hit the transition point. Graphically, the game's textures and backgrounds look pretty good. As I mentioned, getting those panning out views or when the maps go to take a turn, being able to see down the hallways is really sweet. Character models of playable characters though, mainly during cutscenes, really could have used a little refinement, but the same thing can be said for the multiple spelling and grammar errors in the subtitles, of the pretty poorly written and unbelievable dialogue, which further has some of the worst voice acting I've heard this generation. And here is why I always finish a game before I make a review. For me personally, here's how I'll sum up my time with this game. In the first 2 hours, I was super impressed with the formula. The moveset, the camera, the abilities. By 5 hours, I was still enjoying it. By 8, I really thought it should have been wrapping up. By the 12th hour, I was ready for it to end. With 15, I was under the repetition thumb, really starting not to enjoy it. By 18, I was just skipping puzzle rooms for items, just hoping that the game would end. By 20, I was cursing the game for its futility. By 22, I couldn't believe it was finally over. Your mileage may vary. Overall, Aeternoblade II has some great ideas that just ended up not being executed as fluently as hoped. The 3D space for the 2D side-scrolling was neat. The idea of 3D battle rooms and arenas in a side-scrolling game is really cool. The significant number of movesets, the promise of multiple characters, the time manipulation abilities, the 3D map, upgradable stats and relics, tons of individual thought-provoking puzzle rooms, but just the battle repetition, the nonsensical story, the poor writing and voice acting, the random switches that operate doors on opposite sides of the world to progress, the blue screen crashing from bosses, the lack of a functional 3D camera, and constantly adding and removing your abilities in a Metroidvania style game, before finally releasing you back on the 14 hours left of the game with nothing new, Just kind of made this game feel like it was stretching on forever. Rated as a 2D item procedural, Aeternoblade II gets a 38 out of 100 on a 0 to 100 scale, where 50 is an average game. This is Jiro for Umbra Games. Thanks for watching.